In June of 1287 BCE, Egypt's army was on the march. The pharaoh Wasmuria Riamesses, or Ramesses II, was leading his troops across Sinai. They were approaching southern Canaan, whence they would turn north for Syria. Their ultimate destination was the city of Kedshah, also known as Kadesh. The army, strung out along the roads, numbered 20,000 men in 4 great divisions. The divisions were named, each one for a great god. There was the division of Sutek, or Seth, marching in the rear. Then, the divisions of Ptah and Ra formed the middle. Finally, in the lead, the division of Amun marched with the king himself. The trek across Sinai would take approximately 12 days, covering 280 kilometers or 170 miles. As they marched, the battalions would stop at fortified outposts and way stations. These were established, or at least recorded, by Ramesses' father, King Seti I. Seti had led multiple armies through this land, and he references small forts and supply depots from the eastern delta well into southern Canaan. In other words, the armies were not marching through the wilderness. This was a controlled zone, probably well guarded and policed by military forces. And every night, the soldiers could camp in relative security at one of the outposts. For such comforts these might provide, there was no escaping the physical burden of the march. The land was hot and dry, with dust blowing in from the desert. By night, the temperature dropped rapidly, and there would be a damp chill to the air coming in from the sea. You can imagine the troops baking by day, shivering by night, a thoroughly unpleasant experience all round. The difficulties of army life are well recorded by Egyptian scribes. Multiple texts, written as literary exercises, describe the miserable lot of the soldier and other professions. One example, from the Papyrus Anastasi, speaks of a hard-knock life from training up to battle. It says, quote, "Come, I will describe to you the lot of the foot soldier, that much exerted one. He is brought as a child and confined to the barracks. A painful blow is dealt to his body, a savage blow to his eye, and a wounding blow to his brow. He is harangued with beatings. Come, I will describe to you his journey to the land of Karu, which is Canaan and Syria, and his march over the hills. His bread and water are carried on his shoulders like a donkey's burden. His neck becomes calloused like a donkey's, and the arches of his back are bent forward. He drinks foul-tasting water and pauses only to stand guard duty. When he reaches the enemy, he is like a captured bird with no strength in his limbs. If he succeeds in returning to Egypt, he is like a stick that the woodworm has eaten. He is full of sickness." End quote. Another text, Papyrus Lansing, tells a similar tale. It says, quote, "Let me tell you the woes of the soldier. He is called up for Syria. He may not rest. There are no clothes, no sandals. The weapons of war are assembled at the fortress of Charu. His march is uphill, through mountains. He drinks water every 3rd day, but it is smelly and tastes of salt. His body is ravaged by illness. The enemy comes, surrounds him with missiles, and life recedes from him. He is told, 'Quick, forward, brave soldier, win for yourself a good name.' But he does not know what he is about. His body is weak, his legs fail him. He dies on the edge of the desert, and there is none to perpetuate his name. He suffers in death like he did in life." End quote. Now, these texts probably exaggerate to some degree. They belong to a literary genre that scholars call the satire of the trades. Another name for it could easily be "Why Every Job is Terrible and You Should Become a Scribe." The authors of those texts were trying, with sarcasm and humor, to prove that their job, being a scribe, was the most pleasant and comfortable of all, so maybe the soldier's life wasn't quite so harsh. Then again, if you strip away the rhetoric, some of the basic experiences are recognizable. The physical burdens and heavy loads, the long marches in miserable territory, the sickness and exhaustion, the chaos and terror of an enemy attack. Such descriptions probably aren't that far off the mark. To my limited knowledge of soldiering, I suspect many in the armed forces could identify with the basic elements here. Incidentally, if you serve in a military and you're listening to this, do reach out. Let me know how true the soldier's experience sounds. I'd love to hear from some first-hand witnesses. Anyway, for 12 days, maybe more, the Egyptian soldiers marched along the Sinai roads. Finally, their path began to curve north as they entered the lands of Canaan. The division of Amun reached this area first, their route taking them past towns which, today, we know as Rafah, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Jaffa. All of these sites have archaeological remains testifying to the ancient Egyptian empire and its administration. We'll have a chance to explore that system in the future. But from the historical records, the Egyptian armies tended to enter Canaan through the Gaza region, so this is probably how Ramesses approached it. From there, the army's route would carry on north and eventually east. The Egyptians would enter what is now Lebanon, specifically the Bekaa Valley that runs southwest to northeast, leading to Kadesh. This next part of the march covered some 400 kilometers, or 215 miles. Crossing it would take 18 days. As the army entered Canaan, Ramesses himself rode near its head. The king was about 25 years old, young, energetic, full of martial vigor. But Ramesses was embarking on a major undertaking, pushing an army to the northern limits of current Egyptian influence. What's more, the expedition might very well bring him face to face with the royal army of Hatti itself. The big question is, was he ready for such a confrontation? The march to Kadesh was not Ramesses' first experience of war. Just 1 year earlier, the king had led a force along the Canaanite coast and up into Amaru, what is now western Lebanon and Syria. He had stomped through the region, besieged a town or two, and asserted his rule. That, at least, was one successful endeavor. Before that, Ramesses may have participated in his father's campaigns. We don't have direct evidence for this, but the elder Seti had led multiple wars in his 11-year rule. If Ramesses was 10 years old, give or take, when his father came to power, he may very well have joined some of the later marches. There is evidence that Prince Ramesses had trained for war and participated in military life. Inscriptions at Abydos and a place called Kuban speak of Ramesses as the, quote, supreme commander of the army at 10 years old, and how he, quote, made plans while still in the egg, just a boy with a sidelock. In other words, Ramesses had allegedly participated in military command from his early years in childhood. We treat records like these with caution because there is always an ideological element. Ramesses wanted to be seen a certain way by his contemporaries and subjects. But we also can't discount these records entirely. By regnal year 9 of Seti, when Ramesses was about 19 years old, the prince turns up with titles like Great Overseer of the Troops, or Imira Mesha Wer. So his claims of an early upbringing in military life may have some justification. From princely training, Ramesses probably knew his way around an army, and he may have had experience with command, perhaps even combat. That would serve him well over the next few weeks. As they entered Canaan, the army divisions passed by the Egyptian forts and local townships. Depending on their route, the soldiers may very well have passed near Megiddo, the city where 200 years earlier, Ramesses' predecessor, Thutmose III, had won an epic engagement. Thutmose's victory and the consolidation of Egyptian rule in this region had opened up two routes north into Syria. One was the safe path along the coast, passing by the vassal cities and kingdoms. The other was more direct, heading through Lebanon in what is now the Bekaa Valley. Ramesses would take the second option, heading as straight as possible for the enemy town. But he didn't neglect that safer coastal route. Before making his final approach, the pharaoh paused and divided his army. He mentions this in the story of Kadesh, where the king says how, quote, his person had drawn the first battle line from the leaders of his army. Now they were on the bank in the land of Amaru. End quote. That part comes from the battle itself, so we have to work backwards to figure out the setup. Apparently, Ramesses selected a force from his main army and sent them away as a fifth column. As he describes it, these troops were some of his best fighters. Ramesses calls them the leaders, or Hatti, and describes the group as the first battle line, or Seku Tepi. This passage has caused confusion for researchers, because the next time we hear about these Seku Tepi, they are called by a different name. We'll get into that later. Working through the scholarship, the consensus seems to be that Ramesses divided his army in two. One group, the main contingents, carried on with the king. They would head north along the Bekaa Valley, making straight for Kadesh. The other group, a small force of elite soldiers, took the other coastal road. They headed west and north, and eventually they would pass through the land of Amaru and then swing round upon Kadesh from the north and west. A kind of pincer movement, if you will. Based on the inscriptions, Ramesses and his generals probably decided this plan before the army ever left Egypt. When he described the beginning of the campaign, Ramesses said, quote, his person distributed supplies to his troops, they being kitted out with all of their weapons, and the plan of campaign was given to them. End quote. Ramesses does not describe this plan, which is called the Tep Red, but it probably concerned the marching routes and divisions of soldiers that I've just described. Given the limits of communication, the fact that most of the army was on foot and messengers were going by horseback at best, those plans would need to be reasonably flexible. The ancients simply didn't have the means to stay in close, rapid contact, so coordinating these divisions and their movements was going to require a certain degree of luck. But, at the very least, as the army entered Canaan, the commanders and troops probably had a good idea of what was expected. Beyond Ramesses' army, the locals of Canaan also would have known what was happening. Before they launched their campaigns, Egyptian monarchs seemed to have called upon their vassals for logistical support. The petty rulers of Canaan and southern Syria would need to provide accommodation and supplies for the soldiers of the pharaoh. We don't have explicit records of this for the Kadesh campaign, but we do have earlier documents, like the Amarna letters, that describe similar circumstances. From these, we can make a few educated guesses. A bunch of letters from Amarna describe preparations for a campaign. Some of these messages came from the pharaoh himself, like one where the king says, quote, say to the ruler of this local territory, be on your guard, you are to protect the place of the king where you are located. The king of Egypt sends to you an overseer of stables named Hatti, the son of Myreia. And what he tells you, listen very carefully, because if you don't, the king of Egypt would find fault with you. May you prepare for the arrival of the king's archers. Gather food in abundance, wine, and everything else in good quantities. The overseer, Hatti, is going to reach you very quickly, and he will cut off the heads of the enemies of the king. End quote. We also have messages from the vassals themselves, the rulers in Canaan and Lebanon, all the way up to Ugarit in Syria. Responding to royal commands, these petty rulers promised to make preparations for the Egyptian troops. One letter describes how the ruler, quote, falls at the feet of my lord 7 times and 7 times. Because the king of Egypt has sent me orders, I am heeding them. I guard the cities of the king, and I prepare for the arrival of the royal archers. Another message talks about provisions, and the Canaanite says, quote, to the king, my lord, my sun god, I prostrate myself 7 times and 7 times. Indeed, I am obeying the orders of the king. I have gathered food, strong drink, oil, grain, oxen, sheep, and goats for the arrival of the king's soldiers. What kind of dog would not obey the orders of the king?" End quote. A bit of sycophancy at the end, but you get the point. Royal envoys went forth from Egypt. The loyal vassals gathered supplies, ready to receive troops. All of that happened in the Amarna era, about 60 years before Ramesses II. But we can safely assume that, preparing for Kadesh, the pharaoh sent instructions of a similar nature, commanding his vassals to prepare supplies. Unfortunately, that diplomatic preparation came with a cost. As the envoys arrived in foreign courts and gave their instructions to local rulers, there is every chance that unfriendly ears were listening. And as the vassals themselves went to work, sending out their agents to collect supplies from the hinterland, word would rapidly spread that an Egyptian army was coming to Canaan. If there's one thing we know about humans, it's that news travels fast. And there's every chance that as Ramesses gathered his army, crossed Sinai, and then entered Canaan, his movements were already known in foreign lands. In short, there's a decent chance the Hittites knew he was coming. We'll explore that in just a moment. Having made his arrangements and divided his forces, Ramesses and the 4 army battalions set off on the final leg of the journey. They entered an area that, today, we know as the Bekaa Valley. This is a shallow canyon running southwest to northeast, and it leads more or less directly to Kadesh itself. Fortunately, Bekaa was not enemy territory. Kadesh might be a rogue nation, willing to side with any of the great powers that were close enough, but the lands south and east of Kadesh remained a part of Egypt's vassal network. So, as the 4 divisions, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Sutek, entered the Bekaa Valley, they were still secure and safe. The Egyptians called Bekaa the Valley of the Conifers, or Ta-Inet Pa-Ash, which gives you an idea of the landscape. Thickly forested with tall, straight trees, and probably quite shady compared to Egypt. Maybe there was rain sometimes, or mist rising over the trees in the mornings. After the burning heat of Sinai, Bekaa must have seemed a pleasant march, a nice way to approach their destination. Traversing the Bekaa Valley would cover approximately 150 kilometers, or 93 miles. At their normal rate, it would take the army 7 days to cross that length. So for now, I would like to leave Ramesses and his troops as they pass through Bekaa. In a week, we will catch up with them as they arrive at Kadesh. For the rest of this episode, I'd like to take a moment to head north. We've told this tale almost entirely from the perspective of Ramesses and the Egyptians. But a war takes 2 combatants, and it's time we caught up with the enemy. What was going on in Hatti? Around June of 1287 BCE, Ramesses II was on the march through the lands of Canaan. Far away in Anatolia, the great king of Hatti, Muwattalli II, seems to have learned of Ramesses' campaign well in advance. He might have had scouts or spies travelling through Canaan and Syria, or he may have relied on his vassals to report back on important news. Many of the treaties that kings of Hatti made with their neighbours survive to this day, and they often include provisions that require their vassals to report on any bad news they receive. Logically, that would include news of a war. So as Ramesses prepared for his march, the odds are extremely high that one or multiple sources sent word to Muwattalli. We might even have an example of just such a message. A clay tablet excavated at Ugarit on the coast seems to be a letter from a Hittite commander. He sent a report to his overlord back in Anatolia, and a copy of that report survived in the ruins of Ugarit. In this general's letter, the Hittite official tells how, quote, Since this last month, I have been located in the land of Amaru, and I keep watch on them day and night. I watch over their roads and their gates. Half of my chariots are positioned on the coast. The other half are at the foot of Mount Lebanon. Furthermore, my troops conducted a siege in a local town, and from that stronghold they captured a man. I have been interrogating the prisoner, and he said, "The king of Egypt is going forth. On the day of the monthly festival to come, his army will start out, and the king himself will come in the wake of that army." End quote. This remarkable letter seems to describe the preparations of a pharaoh who is going forth on campaign. To be clear, there is no evidence that this letter specifically refers to the Kadesh campaign. It might belong to that event, but the Ugarit archive covers a period of several decades, in the late 14th and early 13th centuries. So the letter could equally describe Seti I, Horemheb, even I or Tutankhamun, all of whom sent armies to these lands. But whichever pharaoh it describes, you can see the problem. As preparations began, and as royal messengers arrived at vassal communities, the news of a campaign spread. If the Hittites had any spies in the region, and they clearly did on at least one occasion, the great king would learn of Pharaoh's intentions. That being said, the general's letter is also noteworthy for what it doesn't mention. The Hittite, whoever he was, said that the king of Egypt was going forth, and he knew the rough date when the campaign would start. But the general did not say where the Egyptians were going to attack. Assuming we haven't just lost that section, perhaps there was still some secrecy around these movements. A king like Ramesses needed to inform his vassals that he was coming so they could provision him, but they didn't need to know his ultimate destination. Thus, while news would spread, there remained an element of the fog of war. Armies move unpredictably, and they can appear where least expected. With that in mind, the Hittites could prepare a force, but knowing exactly where to take it, that was another matter. Whatever he knew or didn't know, the great king of Hatti took the threat seriously. Working backwards from the Kadesh inscriptions, we can say that as the pharaoh marshaled his forces, crossed Sinai and entered Canaan, Muwattalli II was doing something similar. In the hieroglyphs and art that show Kadesh, Ramesses barely describes his own army. He assumed his audience understood that part. But he does elaborate on the Hittites who came to the battle. The temple art includes large-scale depictions of the enemy, and small hieroglyph captions describe their numbers and deployment. There is also a list of the allies or vassals whom the Hittites brought on the march. Combining these records with material from Hatti itself, we can get a basic idea of how Muwattalli prepared for this war. First question. How big was the Hittite army? According to Ramesses, the enemy fielded an enormous force at Kadesh. The temple inscriptions show Hittite battalions with small captions that say 18,000 men, 19,000 men, 3,500 chariots. The total from those texts is about 40,500 warriors. Such a vast force raises eyebrows. For one thing, it was twice the size of Ramesses' supposed army, which we estimate around 20,000 troops. Additionally, you should always be suspicious of nice, tidy, round numbers when ancient writers describe them. Bearing in mind that this figure comes from Ramesses, there is every chance he's exaggerating the number to make the danger, and thus his bravery, seem more potent. On the other hand, Ramesses also claims that Muwattalli had gathered vassals from across his empire. And Hittite treaties do include stipulations that when the great king commanded, his vassals must send troops. We'll talk about the allies themselves in a moment. But the point is, if Muwattalli had brought his own troops and those of his neighbors, such a vast host is not totally impossible. At least, that is the assessment of Hittite scholars like Trevor Bryce and Richard Beale, who have published on the Hittite military. The records from Hatti itself, detailing their society, do suggest that the great kings maintained a large standing army. From clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform, we hear about a professional force called the Uku Ush. Hatti's permanent troops were organized in divisions of about 1,000 men each, and they were often assigned to princes or prominent members of the court. The size of this professional force is not clear, and I'm not a Hittitologist, but the scholars I've read seem to agree roughly on a standing army of about 10,000 men. We'll meet the individual troops and the princes who led them at the Battle of Kadesh itself, because Ramesses gives some wonderful details about them. For now, let's talk training. Excavations at various sites, like the capital city, Hattusa, have brought to light fragmentary tablets that describe military practices, oaths, and training. There are documents for the royal bodyguard and the preparation of chariot warriors. The second one is intriguing. It describes a multi-stage process of instructions. Soldiers would learn the correct way to hold their bow, probably a good start, then how to gauge distance and aiming, which is trickier than it sounds if you're riding on a moving cart. They also learned how to do these things under adverse conditions, like riding full tilt on their chariot or being shot at. Finally, they would even learn how to sharpen arrowheads for a bit of battlefield maintenance. Reviewing these skills, the chariot archers performed tests. They did that before the ruler himself, and the training text describes the expectations for this and the rewards for success. It says, quote, "When they, the archers, shoot before the king, he who hits the mark, to him they give wine to drink." End quote. There was also a punishment for failure, which says, quote, "He who does not hit the mark, to him they give a bitter cup. Then he runs the review naked." According to one translation, this bitter cup might be a draught of urine. Brutal. That is the training for chariot archers. For the drivers, we have slightly different records. A remarkable document known as the Kikuli text, Kikkuli, describes the training regimen for horses. This program was elaborate, lasting at least 184 days, starting in the autumn. According to Kikuli, the trainers should lead their animals on various exercises, aiming to build strength, speed, promptness in obeying commands, and, perhaps most importantly, stamina over long distances. To do this, Kikuli recommended a form of interval training. The horses would run for 3 miles, or 4.8 kilometers, then trot, then walk, then repeat in cycles, before retiring to the stables at night. Kikuli even recommended different types of feed, including grass, clover, barley oats, and hays. Finally, there were days for swimming, crossing waterways, or simply resting in the pasture. Hypothetically, by following this program, Hittite charioteers could grow the strength and stamina of their horses, priming them to draw the heavy carts. The Kikuli text also includes training for the drivers, including 32 days of night maneuvers, so that they could move in darkness while remaining effective. In theory, this would extend the range of the Hittite chariots and be useful over long distances. Properly applied, the lessons of Kikuli might allow a Hittite chariot force to move while their enemies were resting, to avoid the worst heat of the day, and, potentially, arrive where they weren't expected. The Kikuli text is a wonderful record of ancient training practices. I have only touched the briefest elements, but the document is available online if you're interested. I'll put some links in the episode description. Before we move on, there is one last detail that I simply love. The Kikuli text opens with a mention of its author, and it says where he came from. The first line goes as follows, quote, "Thus speaks Kikuli, the horse trainer, who comes from the land of Mitanni. End quote. Kukuli worked for the kings of Hatti, but he was not himself a Hittite. Instead, Kukuli was a Hurrian, a man from the land of Naharina, also known as the Kingdom of Mitanni. Today, Naharina is part of northern Iraq and Syria. The Hittite monarchs had invaded this region decades before Ramesses II. As far as the surviving material goes, the Hittites pretty much annihilated the Mitanni government. They smashed it from a top-tier power into second-rate status. When they did so, the great kings probably deported part of the Mitanni army or its people. A man like Kukuli, who had developed a particular set of skills, seems to have been taken as a valued partner. Today, he is immortalized as one of the first recorded horse trainers, an early scion of a long-lasting profession. Finally, we have the Hittite allies and vassals. One of the remarkable features of Ramesses' inscriptions is a list of the peoples that accompanied Muwattalli to the field. Apart from the Hittites themselves, Pharaoh claims that the enemy army included 18 distinct groups. Some of them are quite surprising. First, there were the people from Syria. According to Ramesses, the enemy coalition included soldiers from Kadesh, obviously, Aleppo and Carchemish, both in central Syria, the land of Nuhashi, which is probably northern Syria, not far from Aleppo, a land called Mushnatu, which is unknown, but the Hittites might have called it Mushunipa, the land of Ugarit on the western coast. This had formerly been a trading partner and vassal of Egypt, but recently it had fallen under Hittite influence. There were troops from the land of Naharina, or Mitanni, the same region as Kukuli. Then there was, quote, the entire land of Kadesh, which seems to be a term for western Syria as a whole. Then Ramesses gives a list of the peoples of Anatolia. Apparently, the Hittites drew from north, south, east, and west. The list mentions warriors of Alshe in eastern Anatolia, Kizuwatna in the southeast, Pidasa, south-central, Arzawa and Luka, southwest, Masa and Karkisha in the far west, Kabasu, which is unknown, but possibly Kishpua, also far west, Dardania in northwestern Anatolia, near the modern Dardanelles. Then, in northern Anatolia, there was the land of Gasgas, also known as Kaska, along the coast of the Black Sea. Finally, there were troops of Arwana, again unknown, but possibly near Kaska. Ramesses lists 18 kingdoms as part of the Hittite coalition. It seems to be a broad swathe of their land and their vassals. Unfortunately, we have no idea if Ramesses' list is accurate to the events of the day. That is, we don't know if all of these warriors and their leaders were physically present on the field. Bearing in mind the context, Ramesses, or his scribes, may have expanded the actual list to include all of the vassals that Hatti rules and that we know about. After all, it certainly sounds more impressive the more enemies you add. So as usual, we treat these records cautiously. That being said, the extensive list does say something about Egyptian knowledge of their northern rivals. Clearly, generations of diplomats and record keepers had been paying attention to Anatolia and the surrounding lands, and when it came time to make a list, the pharaoh's scribes could include a surprising number of peoples. A couple of interesting names stick out from Ramesses' list. The mention of Naharina, or Mitanni, is intriguing. Recently, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma had broken the back of Mitanni in savage campaigns. The results of that campaign were that Mitanni essentially faded from the international scene, and by 1287, the region of northern Iraq and Syria had become vulnerable to external threats. The kingdom of Assur, for instance, commonly known as Assyria, was starting to push against Naharina around this time. The Hittites monitored the political situation, but they never allowed Mitanni to rise again, so it's surprising to find troops of Naharina supposedly at Kadesh. If warriors of this land did come to the battle, it might suggest there was some power left in the old kingdom of Mitanni. Secondly, the mention of Gaskas, or Kaska land, is interesting. This area, along the northern coast of Anatolia, was not exactly friendly to Hatti. In fact, the Kaskan people were a constant menace to the great kings. The Kaskans raided and ravaged Hatti's hinterland on a regular rotation, and despite multiple campaigns, the Hittites found them extraordinarily difficult to subdue. The idea that Kaskan soldiers were present on the battlefield seems surprising. Perhaps it was a rare quiet period, with the two lands finding some rapprochement. Or maybe a lone Kaskan tribe had joined Muwattalli as he prepared to head south. Either way, it's another one of those, were they actually at Kadesh, or is Ramesses just listing foreigners that he knows about? Take it either way, it's a fun people to include. Finally, the most obvious, hey, look at that, is the mention of Dardania. This is probably a reference to the communities near Troy. According to the Iliad, the Dardanoi lived at Mount Ida in the Trojan land. Their leaders included a secondary branch of the Trojan royal family and a famous prince called Aeneas. Unfortunately, the Dardanoi, or Dardanians, do not appear in Hittite records, so there is no definitive evidence for their location or political status. Then again, if Dardania is the region around Troy, then we might hear about it by an alternate name. Some Hittite documents refer to a kingdom called Wilusa. Later Greeks would render Wilusa as Ilios, from which we get Iliad, the epic poem of the Trojan War. Hittite records mention Wilusa, and they also mention an area called Truisa, which is likely the Greek Troie or Troy. In this period, the Wilusans, or Trojans, seem to have been vassals of Hatti. Our best evidence for this is a treaty, which was made between the king of Wilusa and the great king himself, Muwattalli II. The treaty survives on clay tablets recovered from the old Hittite capital. It marks an agreement between Muwattalli and a ruler of Wilusa named Alakshundu. You might prefer the Greek version, Alexandros, which, in mythology, is the true name of the Trojan prince Paris. There is no evidence that King Alakshundu and the mythical Paris are connected, but the presence of an early Greek name in the region of Troy is quite intriguing, suggesting some cultural interactions and influence. It wasn't universal. An earlier king of Wilusa, who is name-checked in the same treaty, was called Kukuni, which is decidedly Anatolian in origin. For those curious, the name Priam, from the mythological king of Troy, may also be a local name, Paria Mua, which roughly translates as preeminent in power. Again, the legendary characters are just that, characters. Their names and some deeds may have historical inspirations, but we can't, and probably shouldn't, try to map figures like Priam or Paris onto specific individual rulers. Anyway, Ramesses mentions the people of Dardania being present at Kadesh. Again, we have no evidence if this is accurate or simply a, we know these people serve Hatti, put them in the list. Dardania itself appears in Egyptian records as early as the 18th dynasty. Kings like Amenhotep II and Amenhotep III mention them in their lists of foreign lands. It's a shame we don't know more about them, but archaeologists continue to excavate Troy and nearby communities. Hopefully the future will expand our knowledge. For now, we have Ramesses' mention of the people who might be Trojans, and how they supposedly came to Kadesh. Assuming Ramesses' list is accurate, that all of these people came to the battle, you have to wonder, how did Muwattalli organize that? The list includes warriors from every direction, every part of Anatolia and Syria. Beyond the sheer logistical challenge, just convincing this many people to march must have been a major undertaking. At least some of these armies came through obligation. I have already referenced the treaties that the great kings made with vassals, and the various provisions included in those. As you can imagine, another common demand that Hittite rulers would make was that a vassal should support them in war. This provision is fairly common, and it usually goes like, quote, "If I, my majesty, write to you, saying, 'Take charge of your infantry and chariots, and send them to my aid immediately,' then you will do so. And if someone rebels against my majesty, or the descendants of my majesty, then you will send infantry and chariots immediately." End quote. Similar demands appear in multiple treaties, so that was one way to rustle up the numbers. Treaty obligations are great, but they'll only get you so far. There may also have been a financial incentive. According to Ramesses, the great king of Hatti had paid some of his vassals for their troops. Describing the enemy coalition, Pharaoh says, quote, "The wretched ruler of Hatti had come to Kadesh. He had gathered around himself all foreign countries, to the very limits of the sea. There was not one country that was not brought from every foreign land. Their rulers were there with Muwattalli, each man with his forces. The king of Hatti left no silver in his land. He stripped himself of all his property, and he gave it to these countries to bring them with him in order to fight." End quote. Again, that comes from Ramesses, so we take it with a grain of salt. But the mention of silver is interesting. Why not pay with gold? Well, the peoples of Anatolia had been mining silver for thousands of years. Archaeologists have found traces of this well back into the prehistoric era. They mined copper as well. But evidence for gold mining and working of gold is much less common in Hatti, which suggests that for the great kings, silver was the most accessible of the precious metals. That tracks with their written sources. Hittite treaties with their vassals often demand gold as a regular tribute. And when the great kings sent letters to Egypt, they, like many rulers, frequently asked for gold. So it seems that for Muwattalli, the easiest currency was silver. Ingots or precious items would flow from his palace to the distant lands of Anatolia. All across the region, petty rulers would receive these gifts to adorn and enrich their households. And having received such generosity, or bribery, as Ramesses implies, they summoned their troops in great quantities. Muwattalli got his army. If Ramesses tells it true, then Muwattalli gathered allies and vassals from a wide swathe of the Near East. From northern Mesopotamia, western Syria, all four quadrants of Anatolia, and Kadesh itself, soldiers began to marshal at the great king's command. Before too long, this 7-region army was assembling for war. Where would they go? Within Syria, the Hittites had 2 major strongholds. In the east, near the Euphrates, there was Carchemish, formerly belonging to Mitanni, then attacked by pharaohs like Thutmose and Horemheb. Carchemish had become a stronghold of Hittite governance. The great kings dispatched representatives, often members of their royal family, to oversee the city and the region. The other stronghold was Aleppo, ancient Halab. It once ruled its own kingdom, called Yamhad, but like so many, the Hittites had forced Aleppo into vassalage. By 1287 BCE, the city/kingdom was ruled by a local monarch, whom Ramesses helpfully calls the wretched ruler of Halab, Pa wer Chesi en Khirba. He doesn't give him a name or anything, but as a vassal of Muwattalli, the ruler of Aleppo would participate in the Battle of Kadesh. Based on the geographical layout of this region, the Hittite army probably gathered somewhere near Aleppo. Carchemish is a bit far east for an easy route to the south, and when Ramesses described events leading up to the Battle of Kadesh, he specifically says that Muwattalli had gathered his forces at Aleppo. The city was approximately 190 kilometers north of Kadesh, as the falcon flies, so it was at least 10 days' march between the two centers. But that might have been an advantage. Bearing in mind the fog of war that I talked about earlier, gathering his forces near Aleppo might give Muwattalli time to receive news and assess the situation. Then, depending what he learned, he could decide where to take his army. From all of this, we can paint the basics of a historical picture. In summer of 1287 BCE, approximately, the great king of Hatti set forth from Anatolia. With him, he brought a standing army of at least 10,000 men. He had his royal bodyguard, thousands more, chariots, several hundred at least, and countless support staff, laborers, and slaves to provision his great host. As Muwattalli and his troops marched south and east, heading into Syria, they were gradually joined by other forces. Vassal armies came from as far as the Black Sea, the Kaska land, to the coast of the Aegean, Arzawa, and Troy. And as the Hittite armies entered Syria, they were joined by the local warlords. And every week, every day, new battalions arrived from distant lands. 40,000 people might have come in service to Muwattalli. Ramesses II was ready for his war, but the Hittites were ready for theirs. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Next week, it's the big one, the Battle of Kadesh between Ramesses and Muwattalli and a great many Egyptian and Hittite warriors. Now that we've got the essential table setting out of the way, we can focus on the battle itself. I look forward to sharing it with you. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by all of you who listen, but I'd like to give special thanks to my subscribers on Patreon, who help me to afford the essential research materials and things like rent and food, which I need to survive. I would especially like to thank the top-tier subscribers, who are the priests. These fine folks give most generously every month, and I am in their debt. My thanks to Linda, Eric, Terry, TJ, Yola, Mycost, Andy and Chelsea, Nidin, Ashley, Daniel, Veronica, James, Jeffrey, Jean, Karen, Siyen, Dan, Chris, James M, Setnacht, Suyon, and Eryan. And I would like to welcome Kate from Missouri, who recently upgraded her membership from an overseer to a priest. Kate, my eternal thanks. I bow 7 times and 7 times before your generosity. Truly, what dog of a podcaster would not welcome such kind support? To everyone listening, thank you for joining the show. I'll see you soon for the Battle of Kadesh.